If you live in a democracy, you may take for granted the right to advocate for policy change. You may write letters to your elected representatives or attend a city council meeting organized to gather citizen input. And you can choose from a myriad of climate groups to join, many of which are part of broader advocacy coalitions. Although advocacy takes time and dogged persistence when efforts fail, there are relatively few risks and constraints to advocacy in democracies. But if you are part of the 70% of the world's population that lives in an autocracy, you may want to learn about adaptive advocacy. We'll get to this idea of adaptive advocacy in a minute. But first, let's talk about the 4 stages of influence, or advocacy, that apply regardless of where you live. The first stage of advocacy is mobilizing people to work together in an NGO or less formal group. Mobilizing citizens is difficult under any circumstances, but harder where funding for NGOs is limited and governments impose constraints on civil society and open discussion. Once people are mobilized, a climate advocacy group needs to examine their particular niche or contribution in the larger advocacy coalition. Interest groups might compete with each other for resources and access to policymakers, or form coalitions that work together to grab the attention of those in power. Coalitions allow groups to complement each other's expertise in climate sciences and advocacy strategies, and have a louder voice in influencing policy. The next step in influencing policy is for groups to determine their advocacy strategies. Organizations might ask, how can we foster allies among policymakers? Should we start at the local level, where access to policymakers is easier, and then scale up any efforts that have demonstrated success? How might we frame the climate change issue to attract the interest of policymakers? By, for example, framing it as threatening citizens' health. Finally, organizations might ask what strategies could cross a red line for policymakers and thus spur a crackdown, like shutting down a social media site or even arrest and jail time. When considering how to access those in power, groups can ask, what climate expertise do we have that might be valuable to policymakers? Such scientific information is valued in both democracies and autocracies. Next, groups might ask, what information about how citizens view climate change and the way the government is handling the issue might be valuable to policymakers? Information about citizen support for specific policies is more valued in democracies because elected officials need to know how to position themselves for re-election. But it's also valued in autocracies where officials are not holding town halls or otherwise regularly communicating with citizens, and risk being so out of touch that they will lose control to protests or even violence. Importantly, autocrats have greater ability to crack down on dissent, often in unpredictable ways, leading to risks for advocates. Thus, advocates need to constantly reevaluate their strategies and adapt as needed. They need to be ready to switch tactics or even goals to avoid repercussions and to take advantage of windows of opportunity when a policymaker might be more open to new information. And they need to be persistent and resilient in the face of government scrutiny and loss of access or resources. We all need to be adaptive advocates, but the greater the challenges we face, the more we need to be constantly adapting our strategies. In the end, advocacy groups want to influence policy outcomes. This can be convincing the local government to establish a food recovery organization to share food that would otherwise be wasted, or persuading a state to monitor and cap abandoned oil wells leaking methane, or at the national level, passing legislation that incentivizes the purchase of electric vehicles. Regardless of where you live in a democracy or autocracy, keep in mind the 4 stages of advocacy: mobilization, forming interest groups, deciding on strategies, and influencing policies. And advocates need to consider channels of access to policymakers and what information policymakers need to be successful in their jobs. Finally, never forget about the need to be nimble, to adapt your strategies as conditions change, and you gain new knowledge and experience.